All right, welcome back, guys. This is going to be the second episode of a series where I focus on some of the best high dividend yielding ETFs that you can invest in. In the last video, I checked out these three dividend ETFs that have roughly a 7% dividend yield. Definitely check out that video if you haven't already, but in this one, we're going to be focusing on these three ETFs, and these all have roughly a 5% dividend yield, and the reason why I split them up into two separate videos is because they have different characteristics. So in the last video, most of those funds made this trade-off right here, focusing on income and downside protection, and for the most part, they gave up price appreciation to achieve that very high 7% yield. Now, when it comes to the ETFs in this video, they make a different trade-off, and that trade-off is this right here. They focus on price appreciation as well as a healthy level of income. And these three ETFs are QQQX, QYLG, and DIVO. Now, the common thread between all of these funds is that they use covered calls in one way or another. And they use these financial instruments in order to achieve that very high level of income, 5% roughly for all of these funds, and still having good overall total returns. And to hammer this point home on how difficult it is to have a 5% dividend yield and competitive total returns, we can look at some of the funds that didn't make my list. So DIV is a Global X Super Dividend US ETF, and of course this is focusing on cash flow, but it's not using covered calls. So this achieves a 5% dividend yield, but in order to achieve that yield without using any financial derivatives, they have to invest in companies based off of high yields. And I'm sure lots of you veterans out there understand the risk associated with high yield companies. So the dividend yield of a stock is calculated by the annual dividends per share divided by the current share price. So there's two ways the dividend yield can go up. The actual dividends paid can increase, or the share price could decrease, and that's the problem we want to avoid. And if you look at the price performance of this ETF over the past 5 years, it's down 13%. If we zoom out a little bit more, it's still nothing special. In fact, if we compare this ETF versus schd, which is a staple of quality dividend names, there's only a 9% overlap. All of the quality dividend ETFs that do not use financial derivatives have a very low dividend yield. So that's why when it comes to quality high-yielding ETFs, these three are my top choices. So let's begin with QQQX. This is a fund that I've yet to talk about on this channel. So QQQX is a NASDAQ 100 dynamic overwrite fund. And all that means is that it's based off of the NASDAQ 100 index, and they write covered calls off of it. For a bit more information, let's read the fund description. So the fund is designed to offer regular distributions through a strategy that seeks attractive total return with less volatility than the NASDAQ 100 index by investing in an equity portfolio that seeks to substantially replicate the price movements of the NASDAQ 100 index, as well as selling call options on 35 to 75% of the nominal value of the fund's equity portfolio. And this bit right here on how they sell covered calls on 35 to 75% of the index is definitely the most important piece of information because it gives us insight on how this fund operates. If we scroll down a bit more on the website, here's a bit more information on the option strategy. So as of the end of October 2021, the average call option percent coverage was 44%. And the average call strike versus the spot price is 101%. And all that means is that the strike price of these options are basically right at the money, if not slightly out of the money by 1%. So that's how the fund operates, and the results are the following. So over the past 1 year, it's up 26%, and over the past 5 years, 65%. And over that entire time, they've been paying very consistent and growing dividends due to the closed-end fund nature of this investment. And right now, the dividend yield of this asset is just under 6%. So taking a look at the pros and cons of QQQX. So the first pro is the consistent payouts. Coming back to the actual dividend payment amounts, we can see how consistent these are over time, and that's thanks to the managed distribution policy of this closed-end fund. And the other pro has to be the great overall performance with the very attractive dividend yield. The cons are that this is a closed-end fund, and for some people that might be a positive, but something to note, and the expense ratio is also very high at 0.94%. Now the next fund we have on this list is QYLG. So this is also a NASDAQ 100 covered call and growth ETF. Again, trying to get that mixture of income and capital appreciation. And here's an ETF summary of QYLG. So the fund buys the stocks in the NASDAQ 100 index and writes or sells corresponding call options on approximately 50% of the portfolio. And the reason why they sell at the money covered calls on only 50% of the portfolio is so the other half can appreciate with the market without any restriction. And I have to say, comparing QYLG versus QQQX, they are extremely similar. So we saw they cover 44% of the portfolio with covered calls, and they're essentially at the money as well. And that's why if we look at them side by side, they have very similar price movements and dividend yields. The major difference between both these options is that QYLG is an open-end fund or plain ETF, and the expense ratio is also a little bit less. So I have to say the pros of QYLG is the simple and systematic approach. It's always going to have 50% of the NASDAQ 100 index covered with at-the-money covered calls. And there's also an S&P 500 version of this called XYLG if you prefer that instead. The biggest con is perhaps that it's too simple and you can do this yourself without having to buy into this ETF. And perhaps the other con is that the expense ratio, even though it's less than QQQX, it's still relatively high at around 0.6%. So I have to say, QYLG and QQQX are very similar funds, and depending on your needs as an investor, you might want to go with the closed-end fund version or the slightly cheaper and more systematic QYLG. But the final option here is DIVO, and this uses a different strategy. So if you guys have been following the channel, you know this is one of my favorite ETFs on the market for cash flow. And here's a quick little synopsis of what this fund is. So DIVO is an ETF of high-quality, large-cap companies with a history of dividend and earnings growth, along with a tactical covered call strategy on individual stocks. So when it comes to the income, there's two streams within this ETF. So there's the actual dividends from dividend-paying companies, and there's opportunistic covered calls on top of that. We can see the selection methodology for DIVO right here, but the thing that's different about DIVO versus the examples we saw in the beginning of this video is that in order to go from 3% dividend yield to 5%, on top of having dividend income, they have opportunistic covered calls on top of it to bridge the gap. In fact, we can take a look at the holdings at DIVO right here, and we can see lots of quality blue chip dividend paying companies like mentioned in their documents. And if we scroll down to the bottom, we can actually see their call option positions. So they have call options outstanding on Apple, Visa, and Chevron at the current moment. And something else I want to quickly point out about DIVO is, along with having individual companies that they hold, they also invest in ETFs. So right here is the S&P 500 ETF at a weighting of roughly 5%, and also right here they have an ETF for the Dow Jones, also at around 5% weight. And the last thing I want to point out about DIVO, and this applies to the other ETFs on this list as well, is the return of capital. This is something people always talk about, and it's a very confusing topic. We can see with DIVO in this document that came out in October of 2021 that the percent of the distribution that is return of capital is 88%. And return of capital definitely can be a negative thing, but in the case of these funds, the return of capital is the income generated by selling covered calls, which is the entire point of these funds. They're just categorized as return of capital instead of a traditional dividend, because they're not traditional dividends. But keep in mind, DIVO is a hybrid, and the other 12% of the distribution for this month was from actual dividends. So taking a look at the pros and cons of DIVO now, I have to say the equity positions are definitely a positive for this fund. The fact that they have this selection methodology and focus on quality large cap dividend paying companies is definitely a positive for this fund. And that leads to the next advantage, which is the inclusion of real dividends from dividend paying companies. This portion of the payout has the potential to be way more stable than the covered call income, and it can grow over time as companies increase the amount that they pay out in the form of dividends. And finally, the tactical covered call approach is different than the systematic approach that these funds take. Although this can definitely be viewed as a negative of the ETF because management has to make the decision when and where to write these covered calls. But only time will tell if being actively managed will be a disadvantage or an advantage of DIVO. But so far, if we put DIVO against QYLG, they have very similar price performance and they both have around a 5% dividend yield. So there you guys have it. Those are my top 3 choices for a high 5% dividend yield ETF. We have QQQX, QYLG, and DIVO. If you guys enjoyed the video and you're still watching, definitely give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and also check out my previous video on the best dividend ETFs with a 7% dividend yield. I'll leave the video link down below, but regardless, I'll see you guys in the next one.